Hello, this is Meet the Writers. I'm Georgina Godwin. My guest today has been a civil servant for over 30 years and is an expert on many aspects of British government and politics, in particular the support systems to ministers and prime ministers, specifically their private offices, transitions in politics, the handling of changes of government and crisis management, all of which the UK is currently facing. His book is called The Intimacy of Power, an insight into private office, Whitehall's most sensitive network. Alun Evans CBE, welcome to Meet the Writers.
Thank you.
Alun, I wonder if you could start just by giving us a sort of potted bio of your time in the civil service.
Yes, certainly. I joined the civil service pretty much from university, where I'd studied politics and government, so it was an obvious route to go into. I joined in what was called the fast stream, so one got accelerated promotion, and I worked in a number of departments, education and employment. I then went to work at number 10, but before I was at number 10, I was Principal Private Secretary to 3 Secretaries of State, Michael Portillo, Gillian Shepherd and David Blunkett. So in 1997, I saw the transition of power from a Conservative government to a Labour government, and very much up front because I was in private office. And that's what got me interested in private office in particular and transitions. And working in number 10, obviously I then saw the power system up close, right at the heart of government. And again, I was fascinated by the way in which ministers worked with their civil servants, the way in which they relied or didn't rely on civil servants. And in particular, it struck me that whereas much has been written about ministers, much has been written particularly about special advisors, there was very little written about the private office and the way in which that operated, and in particular the way in which it operated during elections at the time of transitions.
Which is exactly what we want to hear
Precisely,
about.
Yeah.
So what is a private office?
A private office is a small team of civil servants who support every minister from the Prime Minister downwards. The Prime Minister obviously has a large private office and an even larger number 10, but even the most junior minister will have 4 or 5 civil servants working directly for them, making sure that the business of government is transacted, that the diary functions are carried out, that the minister is in the right place at the right time to speak to Parliament or whatever he or she has to do, that relationships are struck within Whitehall to ensure that policy is delivered and that communications are effectively as possible. And then also, and this is partly the reason for the title, depending how the relationship works between a minister and a private secretary, they can develop very close bonds and understanding such that a good private secretary can even almost act as within the mind of the minister and understand what he or she is thinking.
But of course they're not elected officials, so who are
They're not
they?
elected, and they're politically impartial as well, yeah.
So who are the private secretaries?
Well, the private sector, it varies. I mean, for a start, if you take the senior office within a department or number 10, the private office of the Secretary of State, the private secretary will be a senior civil servant. Normally there'll be someone who would be interested in politics. You wouldn't apply for that job unless you're interested in the political side of it. And there'd be somebody who the permanent secretary or the head of the civil service has recognised had absolute intellectual powers, organisational powers, small p political powers, so they could actually work for somebody of any party, but also an understanding of the way in which the whole ecology of Whitehall works and the way in which things get done, so that if there's a crisis or something comes left field, they don't panic, they can actually deliver on behalf of their minister or their prime minister.
So the private office and the role of the private secretary has really evolved over time. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of history.
Yeah, I'll do that. I should add perhaps that one of my great heroes in political history was Peter Hennessy, who spoke about the hidden wiring as the nature of the system behind politicians. And I sometimes describe the private office as the junction box, which actually brings everything together. And you ask about how it's evolved. I mean, effectively, the modern day private office goes back almost 100 years, when after the First World War, Lloyd George wanted a more efficient system of government and governance, and the private office was born, and particularly the principle that the private secretary would stay even if the minister changed. And so the the impartiality politically of the civil service in the private office was born. And then throughout history played a key role in the Second World War, working for Churchill, the private office. And then when Wilson came into power in 1964, he made another change in that he brought the first special advisors into government, and he brought in his own personal and political secretary, Marcia Faulkner, who Marcia Williams, as she then was, and she clashed quite seriously with some of the more traditional civil servants, because here was a 32-year-old daughter of a Northamptonshire builder coming in, acting on behalf of the Prime Minister, and that didn't always go down so well.
And that was a political appointee.
And that was a political appointee, and that was the first ever political appointee. And now we've seen a system, and these are sometimes the characters that hit the media headlines, going most recently up to someone like Dominic Cummings, where the power of the special advisors has become very great, potentially disproportionately large. And let me just give you one figure which always surprises people. If you go back to Macmillan's time, 60 years ago, he only had one political appointee in number 10. Rishi Sunak, before the election was called, had 41. 41 special advisors, all allegedly talking on behalf of the Prime Minister. So there is a difference in balance, I would probably argue now an imbalance between the power and weight of the civil service private office and the influence sometimes wielded by special advisors in number 10 and elsewhere.
Because, of course, personalities must matter hugely.
Personalities are absolutely critical. If you get let's just talk about number 10, a relationship between a Prime Minister and their private secretary which works well, that is powerful. Ditto with special advisors. Now, the key to it is, can the civil servants and special advisors get on well? And actually, on the whole, they normally do. But every now and then there are clashes, and those are the ones that hit the headlines. And if personalities break down, the whole relationship can break down.
Now, back in 1990, it sort of went back to basics, didn't it?
Well, 1990 was an interesting year because if one goes beforehand, Margaret Thatcher had become, originally she was very keen to take advice from a wider group of people when she joined the civil service. Somebody said of her that she hated the civil service, but she loved the civil servants who worked for her. But increasingly, during her time, she came to rely on just two people. One was Bernard Ingham, her press secretary, and the other was Charles Pole, her Foreign Affairs private secretary. And the accretion of power to those two people annoyed many people. The senior civil service tried to remove Charles Powell from office, but she even threatened to resign. Remarkably, a Prime Minister threatened to resign if her private secretary was taken away from her. And in the end, events took their toll, as those of us old enough will remember, and Margaret Thatcher was ousted. And John Major came in, and I use the phrase back to basics in the book, but John Major brought in a much more traditional form of private office where he listened to advice, much more willing to have debate in a way that Mrs Thatcher wouldn't. So that brought in a completely different approach to the way in which government was run compared with the very dogmatic and directive way that Thatcher ran it. And then Major had a new principal private secretary called Alex Allen, and one of Alex's jobs was then to handle in 1997 the transition to New Labour, which he did superbly.
Well, tell us about that transition, because it was a whole new look for the private office.
It was entirely. It was a fundamental change in private office. Everybody knew that change was coming because it'd been 5 years of the Conservative government. The election had to be called. And Tony Blair, who took surprisingly very little interest in the machinery of government. Indeed, when I interviewed him, he wasn't even sure what the nature of his private office would be. He would have inherited. He soon found out. But he left that task to someone called Jonathan Powell, brother of Charles Powell, who had worked for Mrs Thatcher. And Jonathan Powell it was, as a special advisor, who devised a new role which he filled of Chief of Staff. He filled it very well for 10 years. It was based on the American idea of having an overall figure within the office who organised things on behalf of the Prime Minister, so the Prime Minister didn't have to do it. So Jonathan Powell was a remarkably powerful and influential figure at number 10. The other person who was powerful and influential was, of course, Alistair Campbell, who came in as press secretary, bringing in a much more robust approach to the way in which relations with the media were handled.
And that was really interesting because he actually came from the media, didn't he?
He came from the media in much the way, interestingly, 30 years before Joe Haynes had come in to work for Harold Wilson from the media. But Alistair came in knowing the way the media worked and wanting to shake up the way in which government worked with the media. And in a way, he wanted to take the media on, which is what he did most notoriously during the Iraq War. But what was, as it were, significant from a historical point of view, which I think is a point of your question, was this began a further shift in the balance of power between the purely civil service-led private office and political appointees such as Powell and Campbell brought into Number 10 by the Prime Minister. And this is something that we've seen continue over the last 20, 25 years.
So when you come to 2010, I know that you interviewed a lot of people for this book, and one of the people you spoke to was David Cameron, who, of course, was the incoming Prime Minister at that time. Tell us what he had to say.
Cameron was a fascinating person to interview, and the first thing he said to me when I asked him about what it was like coming into Number 10 and having to deal with your private office for the first time, he said, well, of course, you must remember that many years ago, back in 1992, at the time of Black Wednesday, that was Cameron speaking, I was a special advisor. He was special advisor to Norman Lamont at the time that the economy crashed out of the ERM. And as he said, then the private secretary was one Jeremy Hayward. And Cameron described it as learning at the feet of his master, because Hayward was one of these brilliant civil servants who attached himself very much to private office. He worked first as private secretary to Norman Lamont at the time of the financial crash. He ended up being principal private secretary to Blair and then to Brown, and then he ended up cabinet secretary to Cameron and May before he died tragically early.
And of course there is a book that his wife put together.
His widow put together a book, What Does Jeremy Think?
Yeah, and if listeners are interested, they can find that, an interview with her in our archives.
Oh, excellent, yeah. So Cameron, although on one level he was completely unknowledgeable about being a minister, he'd never been a minister, he had been very close to the way in which government worked. And he was very keen, particularly because he was leading a coalition, to have a very conciliatory and collaborative form of government. And I think, and I never worked with him, but I think that the Cameron style of government went down well with his private office. And in the early stage, whatever your political views were, they actually got things done with the Lib Dems in coalition, and the first coalition since the wartime arrangements. And Cameron must take some of the credit for that.
So then Brexit happens in 2016. What happens then?
Well, as you say, Brexit happened. Cameron took the decision that he was going to resign immediately, and Theresa May became Prime Minister. Now, what happened, and this is interesting in the history of private office, is that Theresa May decided to bring in as her chief of staff, or as a joint chief of staff, two people, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill. Again, these were two political appointees, and perhaps unlike Jonathan Powell, who we spoke about earlier, or David Cameron's chief of staff, Ed Llewellyn, these two joint chiefs of staff had a robust relationship with the civil service, shall we say. And in the end, after the next general election, they were forced to resign, and she brought in someone called Gavin Barwell as her chief of staff. But more significantly, what was happening was, whereas in the past, if one went back to the 70s, shall we say, private secretaries would often stay a long time in Number 10 and end up serving 1, 2 or sometimes even 3 prime ministers, thereby proving their political independence from the system. There was a much greater level of churn. Many more private secretaries were appointed, many more chiefs of staff. So in the last 8 years, when there have been, 5 prime ministers, there's been something like 8 chiefs of staff and so many principal private secretaries. And often prime ministers brought in somebody who was their chosen or their favourite civil servant. Now, there's nothing wrong with bringing in someone who you like on one level, but to be the principal private secretary to the prime minister, it helps maybe if they're one of the best and actually have the reputation. Whereas what happened with Prime Ministers Johnson, Truss and Rishi Sunak was they all brought in as their principal private secretary their previous principal private secretary from their previous job. Now, that meant there was much greater turnover in number 10. It also meant, I would argue, that if you bring in someone who's worked with you beforehand, they are less willing to speak truth under power and tell you you're doing something wrong. And this, in my view, came to its peak during the so-called Partygate, when, at a time when everyone in the country was following certain rules, it became clear that number 10 wasn't. And that was the occasion on which, in my view, the private office and the principal private secretary should have been waving every red flag they could find and say to the Prime Minister and other officials, we cannot be doing this in number 10. As it was, the private office ended up sending out invitations to the parties, which I quote in my book. And so my conclusion from all of that is, without going back to some golden age that doesn't exist, we do in future need a reset of the way in which private office works. We cannot have the type of Partygate activities again.
Well, indeed, the book actually starts with that email.
It does,
and as
yeah.
you point out, he is going against the actual job description, which is to keep the Prime Minister really true to the ethics and the morals of the government which he serves.
Yeah, and if you have, let me put this generously, an idiosyncratic Prime Minister like Johnson, I could use stronger language, you need someone who is to make sure he is as honest as possible and as accurate as possible. It doesn't need someone to actually encourage him to break the rules, as clearly happened.
And I mean, I just wonder, and I've experienced this myself, having limited dealings with the Foreign Office, is that there's sometimes nobody there with institutional memory. Yeah. And surely, particularly in the Prime Minister's office, you need somebody who has seen how this all works. And
I couldn't agree with you more. And I have to be very careful about wanting to say, oh, it was all better in the past. But the point you make about institutional history is absolutely critical. And if I give another example separate from the Prime Minister's office, if one looks at the financial crashes one has seen and the issues that the Treasury has had to deal with, it helps if you've seen a financial crisis to deal with the next one. And if there is such a rapid turnover of staff, often you'll end up with people who are very bright, very intelligent, very sharp, but if they don't have that institutional learning, that culture from saying, well, this happened 10 years ago and maybe we should learn from that, you have a weakness in the way in which you run your system.
Mm-hmm. Now, we're speaking before the election results are known, and of course, what we're all expecting is a change of government. And so I'm very interested to know then how you do that. As we spoke about in the beginning, I mean, you're an expert in transitions in politics and the handling of changes in government. So how does that work?
Yeah, let me take it in a few stages, if I may. What will have happened already in the run-up to the election, there will have been what are called access talks. So there will have been discussions between the civil service and Keir Starmer and his team. And obviously Starmer is helped in this respect in that he has Sue Gray on his team, and she used to work in government, so she knows government inside out in a way perhaps that Blair didn't going back to 97. But the other thing in terms of what will happen, and this is what I find quite fascinating, and sometimes people don't realise this, is that if, as the opinion polls say, Keir Starmer wins, so let's assume that, he'll win on the 4th of July. On Friday the 5th of July, Saturday the 6th of July, and Sunday the 7th of July, he will appoint just over 100 ministers to all posts within the civil service, the vast majority of whom, including himself, will have had no experience of being a minister, and yet they'll be thrust in over that weekend to become ministers to run the country. And this is where, in the first instance, the private office is the key interface. They will be the first officials who they meet, from the Prime Minister downwards, and it's done remarkably quickly and dramatically. I mean, to take number 10, if Sunak loses at about 11 o'clock on the Friday morning, the principal private secretary in the Cabinet Office and all the number 10 staff will clap Sunak out of number 10 as he leaves through the corridor. An hour or so later, after having seen the King, Starmer, if he has won, will come in and be clapped in by the very same people and welcomed into number 10. And then that afternoon, he will be given the details of the nuclear firing code for our 4 Trident submarines, which he'll have to give instructions to the 4 submarines. This is a sharp and direct transition of power, and it is done also after 6 weeks of tired campaigning by the Prime Minister, and then he has to appoint all these ministers. And it is the civil service, and I'm biased because I was a civil servant, but it's a civil service which keeps the show on the road during the campaign and over this weekend. And it's the civil service which is the first port of call for ministers who want to get things done. They want to make a good impression on the public and on their supporters. And of course, the civil service want to make a good impression as well, because there's nothing better than you can do than prove to a new minister that you are just as loyal to your new minister or your new prime minister as you were to the previous one. And so it's a very poignant moment in our democracy, that weekend. And no doubt a few things will go wrong, but a lot of them will go very well, and it's often down to private office to make sure they do go well.
Now, in this particular election, the polls predicting the results have been very, very clear, and I think nobody's in any doubt that we will have a change of government. But in the past, that hasn't been the case. And so are these meetings going on between the head of the opposition, the leader of the opposition, and the civil service about how the handover might happen, even if it doesn't appear completely clear-cut that they will be taking over?
There are not very detailed discussions between the leader of the opposition and the Cabinet Office in advance of the election. Those, what I described as access talks, are mainly around what policies would a new government want to bring in if there are particular changes in organisations. For example, if they wish to create a new department, they would say that in advance. But what the Cabinet Office, and in particular the Cabinet Secretary, will do, and certainly they did this at the time when there was potential of a hung parliament, they work out scenarios of what if we have to run a coalition, how will we do that, how will we apportion jobs up between the main party and the second party. But of course it's quite difficult sometimes to predict the election result. If you are in Cabinet Office, you've no idea what's going to happen, and you sometimes pick the wrong combination of, I think in 2015, when Cameron surprisingly won an overall majority, having run the coalition beforehand, the Cabinet Office wasn't fully ready for a majority Conservative government. They thought there'd be a continuation of the coalition. So it's sort of a bit like predicting what's going to happen in a very dark room, and they're not sure what happens. But the discussions do go on in advance.
Now, you made mention of Boris Johnson before in his quite chaotic time in office. And I just wonder then how that affects civil servants who can see that this man is out of control, that he's lying to the public, that he's not governing in an effective way. How and why was he allowed to continue in that way when there were really proper grown-ups in the room?
Well, you ask a very good question, and I'm not sure I'll give a very good answer to it, but you're quite right. Here you had, and let's, if I may, just go over some of the things that happened. You had a Prime Minister who, first of all, illegally tried to prorogue Parliament and closed down Parliament because he couldn't get an election. As a result, all 12 Supreme Court judges came out against him, and Parliament had to be put back into operation. Second, as we've touched on, he agreed to parties during the big lockdowns of COVID, and nobody prevented him doing that. And then also, and in some ways this was one of the most egregious things, but it's actually only came out after he'd left office, that he lied to Parliament about the parties and said that he was working on the best advice he had, whereas he clearly knew what was going on. And I think there's two answers to your question. The first one is people, when they saw what he's like, they tried to work around him and sort of try and get the civil service to get him to do things. But he was someone who changed his mind so much you couldn't believe him from one day to the other. And there probably should have been someone earlier on, the Cabinet Secretary or his principal private secretary, who said to him, this is not acceptable behaviour, what you're doing. Whether it made any difference, I don't know. But the fact that that had been on record and put down in writing, I think would have been a good thing to have done. It may have happened, but certainly I've never seen any trace of it.
Yeah. Now, for most of us, we will be watching that famous black door this week. You know, we're waiting for the changeover of power. Number 10's black door there. And that's all we know about it. Yeah. Tell us, there are a number of things that interest me about this. For instance, when people walk up to the door, before they knock, it opens. What's going on there? So there's a camera, there's somebody with a walkie-talkie saying, incoming. How does that work?
Well, there's a camera obviously inside, and there is a permanent guard on the door there. So depending on who it is, the door will open automatically. If it is a visiting head of state, they would obviously make sure they did that. Sometimes if people are coming up, or if a party of visitors and an agreed party of visitors there, they'll deliberately let them knock on the door so they can knock on the door and have photos taken. And you then go inside, and it's a bit like a TARDIS inside. There is a reception area with a fireplace where obviously the photos are often taken with meeting foreign dignitaries. There is then a corridor, quite a long corridor, down which on day one, or the final day of a premiership, the outgoing Prime Minister will go and the new Prime Minister will come down. As I said earlier, it will then be lined with all of the many civil servants who work in number 10. At the end of that corridor, there is then another lobby, and then you go through the door into the cabinet room, which people have seen pictures of, which is this pillared room with an enormous coffin-shaped table around which 30-plus members of cabinet, too large, but that's another story, sit. And that is where on day one, if it's Starmer as is elected as Prime Minister, he will probably go in there, and that's where many of the initial meetings will happen. To the right of the cabinet room, there is another door, and into that room there is a smallish room which is the Prime Minister's study, and that is where the Prime Minister works. And then beyond that, there is another room where the private office works. So you have the cabinet room, the Prime Minister's room, and the private office room all in a row, and they overlook the garden of number 10.
Now, people walking into number 10 are filmed, obviously, and there's media outside, they're shouting questions and things. Is there a way to avoid that? Could they come in?
Yes. And some people do if they want to avoid the media. You can go in via the Cabinet Office, the main door of which is on Whitehall, so you wouldn't be noticed. There is also a back door to number 10. If you come in through Cabinet Office, there is a famous link door where you have to go through, which links Cabinet Office to number 10. And of course, there's a very famous, funny Yes Prime Minister story where a hacker takes the key away, so Sir Humphrey can't come in from Cabinet Office into number 10. But number 10, over the last few years, has increased enormously in size. I mean, when I worked there, 20 plus years ago, there was maybe 150 people work there. There's well over double that number working there now. So not all of them now are within the actual number 10 building. Some of them are in Cabinet Office. And obviously access to the Prime Minister is power. So there will be a bit of a power struggle if Keir Starmer comes in with his new advisors, who gets which offices, because everyone wants to be as close as possible to the Prime Minister, but not everybody can be in number 10 given its size. Right,
so we're about, I think, to have a change of government. Is it going to be stable?
I think the government will be stable. I mean, if the majority is what the polls predict, the government to begin with will be stable. The challenge will always be, as Harold Macmillan said, events. And if the economy does not pick up, there will be economic difficulties. There will always be crises as well. You've no idea what these will be. If you go back to 97, Blair had a honeymoon lasting two or 3 years, and then within the space of 1 year, he had the foot and mouth crisis, he had the fuel crisis, and then most notoriously he had 9/11. Now those changed the shape of his premiership entirely. They defined the premiership, and certainly the Iraq War later on did. It's difficult to say what the crisis will be, except there will be crises, and if Starmer is Prime Minister, he will have to deal with them.
And it'll be down to the civil service to steady the ship.
It will be, yeah.
Alun, thank you very much indeed.
You're
Fascinating
very welcome.
discussion. The Intimacy of Power, an insight into private office, Whitehall's most sensitive network, by Alun Evans, is published by Bite Back. You've been listening to Meet the Writers, thanks to our producer Tamsin Howard and engineer Mariella Bevan. And you can download this show and previous episodes from our website, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your audio. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.